As the Congress Party's draft economic resolution at the end of its 84th plenary is certainly long on intent. While the party has launched a scathing attack on the Modi government's handling of the economy, it is stopped short of giving details on how it would like to get India back on the high growth path. To help us understand the Congress's prescription for growth, joining me now is the chairman of the Data Analytics Department of the Congress Party, Praveen Chakravarti. Praveen, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18. There's a lot that you have spoken of in the resolution on economic situation in India. It's several pages, from GST to the paralyzed banking sector to agriculture and job creation. If I could start by asking you about specifics on each one of those heads, and let me start by asking you about the GST and what the Congress Party proposes. You talk about how this is a flawed GST. You also say that the Indian National Congress stands for a much simpler GST framework with a moderate and reasonable standard rate of tax, the abolition of cesses outside the GST structure, and a transparent mechanism for revenue sharing with states and a robust system of refunds. What should that mean in terms of the rate? Because the government's argument is that in a country like India, it is not possible to tax a Hawaii chappal and a BMW at the same GST rate. So what is the Congress proposing? Are you proposing a single rate of 18%, 15%? What is it that you would like to see?
Sure. On the GST front, since you started off with that, I think the Congress Party has made its position extremely clear in Parliament and outside, which is the Congress Party stands for a much simpler GST, true to its name, a good and simple tax, which is a standard rate of 18% with a merit rate and a demerit rate. Now, to your question about taxing Hawaii chappals and BMWs, I actually think it's a fallacious argument. We are talking about indirect taxes. Indirect taxes hurt the poor much more than the rich. Indirect taxes are inherently regressive, as any economist would tell you. So it is even more prudent to keep an indirect tax such as GST lower and have progressive direct taxes varying to the size and scale of incomes. So I think the argument about Hawaii chappal and BMW is just fallacious.
Okay, you're saying that that argument is fallacious, but then how will you sell the fact and the idea that you will have an 18% tax rate on things which are currently being taxed at 12%, things that are currently being taxed at 5%? How are you going to be able to sell that?
The concept of a GST with one tax, when you take a portfolio of food, goods, services, and we need to start thinking about a simpler tax rate. What was the very kind of premise of GST? It was to collapse thousands of different rates across different states in the country to a much simpler framework.
Yeah.
That was the very premise of GST. So when we step out to do that, I thought about this question even back then, because the premise of GST was to collapse a lots of tax rates into a few tax rates. So sure, there would be some that would now attract a higher tax rate, and there would be a large number of goods and services and food items that would perhaps attract a lower tax rate. And I think that as a concept is very well understood by most people.
Okay, so let me, before I move on to other issues, let me ask you one last question as far as the GST itself is concerned. Look, the fact of the matter is that the Congress is represented in the GST Council. Every decision of the GST Council has been a unanimous decision. It hasn't come down to a vote even for a single decision. If the Congress felt so strongly on the rates issue, why didn't you take that forward at the level of the GST Council?
I think you should go back and look at all the parliamentary debates and all the arguments put forward by the Congress Party. The Congress Party was very clear, and not just the Congress Party. Let us remember the government's own chief economic advisor actually called for a 15 to 16% rate. So it was not just the Congress Party's position. It is also true that world over, GST is about a few tax slabs. So I think it's not right to say that the Congress Party did not make its position very clear. If there is majoritarianism at play in the houses within Parliament,
Sure. No, but I'm talking about the GST Council, where the Congress Party is represented by state finance ministers, and there every decision has been a unanimous decision. But, you know, I don't want to spend too much time on that because this is what we're dealing with at this point in time, and it's a fact. So let me move on to talk about the other critical issue. And you, under your heading, you call it the paralyzed banking sector, and you talk about how because of the unwarranted criticism of telecom, coal and power sector policies of the UPA government, we are in the predicament that we are in today. But if I could talk about the road ahead, what is it that the Congress party envisages when it comes to public sector banks? Are you at all looking at the possibility of bringing down government ownership below 51%? Are you looking at the possibility of consolidation, which is what this government talked about, hasn't gone through with the exception of State Bank of India? What is the prescription as far as the public sector banks are concerned?
Okay, so the state of the banking sector and banking sector world over, whether it's private or public, go through these bouts of crisis. Okay, it's not unique. Economic history will tell you that for time immemorial, the financial services sector or the banking sector has gone through such bouts. So I think we have to separate the arguments of banking crisis and public versus private sector banks. I think it's a little misleading to conflate the two. The fact of the matter is that this crisis has been festering for some time. This was no secret that this required immediate attention. Had the budget of 2014-15 acknowledged this problem and set out to address it, we wouldn't have been in the mess that we are today, where there's 2.6 lakh crores have been written off, 4.5 lakh corporate loans have been restructured. So we wouldn't have been in this mess. So I think the initial assumption that the economy will boom and a rising tide will lift all boats has proved flat. That's now. So let's separate the two. On the issue of private versus public, my own research, which I've done when I was as a fellow in a think tank earlier, has shown that there is no empirical evidence that public sector ownership is what triggers higher NPAs. The fact is, nearly three quarters of corporate lending in the country is by public sector banks. Corporate loans tend to go bad twice as much as personal loans. The private sector banks do not lend enough to the corporate sector. I think it is not very clear to me that had the private sector banks also indulged in the amount and size and scale of lending as the public sector banks, their NPS would be any better. So we do not have evidence of that. Having said all of that, I completely acknowledge that there is rot in the public sector banking system, and we need tighter regulation for that, which is what the economic resolution calls for, both tighter internal and external regulation of all banks.
But what does that
so
mean,
let us not mix this about public sector versus private sector.
Sure, let's leave that aside, public versus private sector. But if I can ask you to explain to us what you mean when you say we need to strengthen internal and external regulation and oversight of Indian banks. You know, give me specifics, because again, we've been doing this series here on CNBC TV 18, and whether it's former RBI governors or it's somebody like Montek Singh Ahluwalia, former deputy chairperson of the Planning Commission, their view is that forget the ownership issue. What needs to happen for the public sector banks to, in a sense, be made much more effective is that the control needs to move from the Ministry of Finance, from the Department of Financial Services to the RBI. And this is something that Governor Patel has spoken of as well, that the RBI has more control and supervision over private sector banks than it does over public sector banks. So leave the ownership issue aside. What do you mean when you talk about strengthening regulation, and on this specific issue on RBI versus Finance Ministry exercising control over public sector banks?
That's exactly what I mean. Separate ownership from regulation. I think today we're mixing the two together. Ownership is independent of regulation, and it should be independent of regulation. Any regulatory body, investigative agency should be independent of the executive. That is political science 101 in building institutions. So I think that is what we mean when we say tighter internal and external regulation. We're not saying tinker with the ownership in itself. We're saying today it all seems very kind of mixed up and jumbled. Let's have a very clear separation between the two. That's essentially what we mean.
So are you then saying that the Department of Financial Services and the government should not exercise any kind of administrative control over public sector banking, and it should just be the Reserve Bank? Is that what you're saying?
No, see, again, when you say, I don't understand what you mean when you say control. As long as you own the bank, you will make decisions. You will make certain decisions about appointments of executives. You will make administrative decisions. You will not make decisions about regulating these banks. So that's what I mean by separating the two. I mean, I think we use the word control very loosely. If you're the owner of a bank, you will be involved in administrative decisions. And I think that is perfectly justifiable.
That is justifiable. What about consolidation, Praveen? Are you in favor of consolidation within the public sector space, banking space specifically?
You know, I mean, I'm not so sure what exactly that would achieve, other than saying maybe it's easier to regulate one bank versus 5 other banks. So, but if that is the sole reason, then we will have to think about it much more harder. But at this point in time, I've not studied that issue well enough to be able to offer an opinion.
Okay, a quick final question on banking before I move forward. 51% or below, is that at all on the agenda if the Congress were to come to office for public sector banks?
I just think all these are wrong starting points. I think we have to acknowledge, I mean, we're trying to cut the feet to fit the shoes, as the Chinese saying goes. I mean, we have a problem. Banking sectors go through problems world over, and have been in history. If we do acknowledge that it is an ownership problem, then we will have to deal with that. But right now, it clearly is a regulatory problem, and we have to deal with the regulatory aspect of it.
Okay, let me move then to talk about the other important issue that the Congress has opined on, and that is the role of the public sector. You say the Congress emphasizes the need for a strong public sector that serves multiple socio-economic objectives. State ownership of businesses in defense production, mass transportation, natural resources, financial services is both needed and justified. So are we to understand that the Congress would then be open to strategic disinvestment, privatization outside of these sectors?
Sure. Before I answer that, I do want to make this point clear. This is a resolution adopted at the Congress plenary. This is not a manifesto. So what is the resolution? Sure. What is the purpose of this document? The purpose of this document is to introspect, take stock, highlight the big challenges, and resolve for the Congress party to solve these challenges and to find solutions to these challenges. This is not a manifesto that will lay out very clear and specific policy issues. Yeah, so I want to make that very clear.
I understand that. I'm just trying to understand the thinking within the Congress at this point on some of these specific issues.
Sure. So I think as the resolution says, the public sector is necessary and is important, and perhaps is more necessary in certain sectors than in the rest. And I think that is the Congress party's position. I don't think it is the position that the private sector and the public sector are mutually exclusive to each other, or we get into long drawn debates and battles about the private sector versus the public sector. I think it's very clear that the resolution, in fact, throughout talks about the importance of private sector. At one point it even says jobs, if jobs is a challenge, large number of good productive jobs can be created only by the private sector, and the Congress party's resolution clearly states that. But that is not necessarily mutually exclusive to a public sector. So the Congress party has clearly said that we're for a viable and efficient public sector in sectors that are perhaps more attuned to the needs of a public sector enterprise.
But does that mean that you're open to privatization? Because for 10 years under the UPA, Praveen, we did not see any strategic disinvestment or privatization. So are we given to understand that that is what will be, or that is the ideology that the Congress continues to hold and take forward? Because this government has made it clear that it is in favor of strategic disinvestment and privatization in non-core sectors and some core sectors as well.
I think what one says and what one does needs to be separated clearly. I think that this government said many things, and we're yet to see a lot of those things happen. That's number one. So number two is privatization. Again, let's go at it sector by sector, case by case, specifics. That's what I meant when I said this is not a manifesto. Please understand, we acknowledge the importance of the private sector. We acknowledge the necessity of the public sector in certain industries. If that means that we will have to look at other sectors and take decisions at the appropriate time, that will be the case.
Okay. Okay, that helps us clarify some of the doubts that we had. So you're saying that it will be a decision on a case-to-case basis. You're not ruling it out altogether, and you are caveating that this is not a manifesto. This is a broad economic thinking of the Congress. On the growing inequality that you talk about in this resolution, one of the ideas to bridge that is a 5% tax on the super rich. How would you, A, define the super rich? And do you believe that that is the best way forward, Praveen? And what would be some of the other ideas that you would like to see being taken forward? Because one of the concerns is, and you know, this has been expressed by your own former finance minister, Mr. Chidambaram, that the UPA got into a habit of writing checks it couldn't afford. So to avert going back down that trap, what is it that you would, you know, like to caution the party on?
Have you read the entire economic resolution? Did you find the 5%?
Yes, I have.
In the economic resolution?
No, but your party leader spoke of it.
When? I was there at the plenary.
At
the Congress party president did not speak of any 5% cess.
Okay. Well, that was what was reported. You're saying that there is no proposal or plan to impose a 5% cess?
This is the economic resolution, and you know, you've read it. This is the final version of the economic resolution that has been passed at the plenary. Do you see a 5% cess in this?
No, I don't see it here as far as your way forward is concerned, which has several conclusions that you've put together in terms of addressing the 5 big challenges that the economy faces.
Yeah. So again, I want to reiterate, I think all of those are very specific policy and taxation measures. I think it's way too premature to, you know, even start discussing all of these. This is about a resolution to identify and take stock and identify some of the big challenges, and also tell the people of India where the current government has gone wrong in its management of the economy.
I want to talk about, before we wrap, Praveen, you know, on agriculture, because we're in the midst of the Niti Aayog working with state governments, trying to design a new formula as far as the MSP is concerned. You spend a lot of time in the resolution talking about the agriculture distress that the country is faced with. You know, on the MSP as well as agriculture, you've made some specific recommendations: managing the agrarian distress, improving agricultural productivity, credit growth, and so on and so forth. What do you think is the most significant priority when it comes to agriculture that needs to be focused on?
Listen, I think the broader farm to non-farm transition that the Indian economy will witness over the next decades is a significant challenge. And I think the Congress party absolutely and clearly acknowledges this challenge, and it is going to be a fairly complex one to manage, and I think that is very, very clear. Now, in terms of the current agrarian distress, I think it's fair to say that the terms of trade in agriculture have shifted adversely against the farmer. Now, there could be various reasons for that, but this is, in some sense, you know, good incomes for the farmers, keeping low food prices, and keeping a fiscal deficit in check is what many economists have called the impossible trinity. And I think that is going to be the challenge, and we acknowledge that. But having said that, when there is visible distress, and it is visible, real incomes for farmers have been stagnant, have been zero let me give you an example.
Yes.
Let me give you the other side. Per capita incomes, real per capita incomes have grown at 7 to 8% in the last 3 years. But real incomes of farmers have stayed flat, have been grown at zero. So clearly there's widening inequality. Clearly you're seeing agrarian distress. In that context, there clearly, surely needs more should have been done by now. I mean, at this very last 50%, cost plus 50% MSPs without defining what is cost, it's just added to more confusion than to even acknowledge and solve the problem of agrarian distress.
All right, Praveen, we will have to leave it there. Appreciate you joining us here to take us through the resolution on the economic situation that the Congress Party has put together at the end of its plenary. We appreciate your time, and we hope to keep in touch with you and get you back on the program as you work out more of the fine print on some of the issues that we talked about here this afternoon. Thanks very much for joining us.